Okay. Uh, Hello, everybody. Welcome to Focatopedia and Osara Talks. Tonight, we will discuss the contribution of Ethnic Art Foundation in Mithila art because it seems like it was an umbilical cord of Mithila art, a feeding cord of artisans since its establishment in 1980. EAF was a brainchild of American anthropologist Raymond Owens and its current president, Mr. David Janton. Raymond was stunned by the beauty of Mithila painting, as they used to state in their papers. He found that the artisans then were underpaid, and to earn their bread, actually, they had to mass produce crude images. To help artisans and to encourage them, Raymond and David came up with a very unique plan of second payment. That means they had to exhibit and sell the paintings in American market and accept donations to sustaining the Mithila painting traditions. 2003 is a milestone in EAF history as EAF founded Mithila Art Institute in Madhubani, a free art school to encourage and train the next generation of Mithila artists. Though it is closed now, undoubtedly EAF contribution in Mithila art means a lot in terms of developing Mathil aesthetics and iconography up to the next level actually. We will try to discuss every aspect of Ethnic Art Foundation within the time frame. And Mr. David Janton, who is our guest tonight in Osara Talks. And now I welcome Aditi. She is also on board. She is an art researcher to the Mithila painting from JNU. And now, Aditi, I would like you to introduce and welcome Mr. David Janton in our Osara Talks. Aditi, over to you.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Sunil sir, for giving me this opportunity to be a part of Osara Talks. And David sir, it's really great to have you on the platform. While doing my research, I read about you. So I did my MPhil on folk art of Mithila, understanding paintings and its intersectionality. So you were one of the main readers, like I had to go through all your articles and everything, your collection. So thank you so much for forming the baseline for my research. So I would like to introduce David sir, who is the president of Ethnic Art Foundation. David sir is a renowned social anthropologist who did his master's and PhD from University of Chicago. He was also the director of International and Area Studies, University of California. For a brief period, he was involved with Ford Foundation as a program officer. And David sir has, as sir mentioned, he was very pivotal in the proliferation of Mithila art and taking it to the global level. And he even instituted Mithila Art Institute, where all the artists could come. And the art was, in a way, we can say, we have to discuss this further, that Mithila art on a global platform was visible because of your contributions to our state. Thank you, David sir, and now I'll request you to take this ahead.
Well, thank you for the invitation to speak on the Ethnic Arts Foundation and Mithila painting, and for this program, this is the first time I've used a Zoom, not as a speaker, not as just a participant, but as a speaker. So this is another first for me as well, and I'm pleased to be able to do it.
Thank you.
The Ethnic Arts Foundation actually began in 1977 as an idea. It didn't exist yet at that point. Raymond and I had known each other for many years before that. We were graduate students together, and we both finished our doctoral dissertations within the same month. We were close friends, and part of the reason we were close, and part of the reason that we were both got involved in this, is that he had done a doctoral dissertation on rural entrepreneurs, on industrial entrepreneurs. I had done a doctoral dissertation on fishing entrepreneurs. Mine was in the Philippines, his was in Howrah, in India. but as we were writing our dissertations, we shared many ideas, many thoughts, and many versions of our scripts, and we became close friends around the idea of how people in village situations generate income and make their livelihoods. The other thing which brought us together was that we were in Chicago and we spent a great deal of time together when we couldn't do our academics anymore at the Chicago Art Institute, which is one of the great art museums of the world. And both of us were very interested in art. So there was an interest back in the 60s and into the early 70s in art and entrepreneurship. And that created a bond between us. As I said, we both finished in 1970, gives you some idea how old we are. And I didn't see Ray again until 1977. For 7 years, we had practically no contact. He was teaching in Texas, and I was working for the Ford Foundation in Manila and in Bangkok. So we had no contact. But by 1977, I was back in New York, and he appeared at my home one day with a roll of wrapped around a set of pieces of paper, a blue plastic roll, the kind of plastic you're probably familiar with. And he unrolled the plastic roll, and in it he had 35 paintings by Sita Devi, by Ganga Devi, by Bawa Devi, by Shanti Devi, a whole series of extraordinary paintings that he had bought over the course of a visit to Madhubani that year. I had no idea what they were. I had never seen anything like them before, but I was immediately struck with the extraordinary beauty and skill that the paintings showed so very obviously. And we talked about what to do with them. What could we do with them? And he explained to me at that time that what was going on in Mithila is precisely what you, Sunil, was talking about. The artists had been enormously popular in the late 60s and early 70s when they were first discovered, when Bhaskar Kulkarni brought them paper, and other people were involved in having them showing their work in Delhi. But that dealers were now coming up to the area and insisting on buying 30, 40, 50, 60 paintings at a time, all of the same subject, usually Sita garlanding Ram, and offering to pay 3 to 5 rupees per painting. And that was all they would pay. And they were the only market that the women had. The artists at that time could not travel. They were almost all women, and they couldn't travel. So they had to deal with whoever was, whatever dealer came along and offered to buy their paintings or insisted on buying paintings which the dealers decided what they wanted. And that was when Ray went to Madhubani. That's what he saw in Madhubani. Now, he went there originally to do research on water issues. And he had a grant to do research on water issues. But Ray had a very strong moral streak. Before he went to Chicago as an anthropologist, he went to divinity school and got a degree in ethics. And I think he just felt that this was wrong, what was going on in Madhubani, the kind of exploitation of the painters, when he knew that there were some painters could do absolutely marvelous, extraordinary work as real artists. And so we sat around my dining table in New York, where I was living at the time, and said, okay, what should we do? How do we support these artists? And we came up with this, what seemed to us to be a very simple plan, which was he would go and buy paintings as he already had done. He bought the 35 paintings that he showed me. we would put on exhibitions and sales in academic places and in museums and among friends, any place we thought that there might be a market for the paintings. And he would then, on his next trip back to India, because he was planning multiple trips to go to India, return the profits from those sales to the artists. So he had bought them where the dealers were paying literally 5 rupees a painting. He would pay 50 rupees or 75 rupees. Still, today, in today's money, that's nothing. But in 1970, that was in the 70s, that was a considerable amount. And when we sold paintings, he would go back the next year and distribute thousands and thousands of rupees to the painters whose paintings had sold. And we kept very careful records of how much he had already paid them for the painting, how much we got for the sale. We decided we would set aside a small amount, some 20 or 30% of the dollar purchase price in the U.S. to run the foundation. That was the sole source of income for the foundation at that time. Other than Ray paying for his travel back and forth to India, he paid for that out of his pocket. He was just willing to support that. Didn't come from anywhere else. And that system is one that we can continue right up until we close. We've stopped selling paintings right now, but that has gone on since 1977 until last year, and the amount that has been retained by the Ethnic Arts Foundation over the years has changed a little bit. It's gone as low as 60%. It's gone. The artist gets as low as 60% or 70%. The reason that it shifted is that later on we started running the art school, and that needed funding as well. And so some of the money that came from sales in the U.S. went to the art school. But that's getting ahead of the game. What Ray tried to do when he was in India in the late 70s and in the early 80s was to organize a cooperative. He had been reading about, learning about art cooperatives in Canada among the Eskimo populations, which were very successful, which enabled the Eskimo carvers to produce all kinds of beautiful carvings. And the Canadian government gave them art advisors and marketing advisors to really build a link between the artists and among the Eskimos and the larger population of Canada. They did soapstone carvings. This is just a tiny version of one of the kinds of images that they were carving that I just picked up just recently. But they did very fine, interesting sculptures. This is a very simple one, and developed a real market for this art. He was aware of that, and he decided that we should do something essentially similar, except that we had no government support. The Canadian government was very active in this. The Indian government had been very active in supporting the artists in the late 60s and early 70s when Basu Kulkarni was bringing them paper and what's her name? The woman running the
Kupul Jaka.
Kupul Jaka, thank you.
Yeah.
She was very instrumental in supporting them in various ways, as was the railroad minister, Mishra. But that government interest at the highest level dissipated very quickly in the 70s largely because several Indian economists said that selling paintings could never be a sufficient source of income, and it would fade away. It was a sort of a brief fashion, as they say, which would fade away, and it would never work as a long-term source of income. They said what the artist should do is start painting tablecloths and bedcloths and saris and commercial items, which would make a lot more money for them. And many did, and some still do. That is a piece of the market. You can still get beautiful saris painted by Mithila painters, but what that meant was it was entirely a commercial operation, and the notion that they were producing art sort of disappeared. Ray, in contrast, wanted to build upon the work of Ganga Devi, Sita Devi, and the great artists of the early generation, and instead, along with offering to pay, 10 times, 20 times what the convenience was offering, would tell them, take your time, work slowly, do paintings that you really care about, that mean something to you, that actually have some content that you are excited about or concerned about or in love with, or you feel deep emotional attachment to what you're doing, not just turning out something for the market. And he would spend anywhere from a month to 6 months in Ranti or in Jitwarpur or in Madhubani with his wife, Naomi, by going around to the villages, talking with the artists about this, encouraging them to do what he said, do your best work. Do your best work. Don't just do what is commercially saleable. Do your best work, and I will buy it. And he would then bring back to the U.S. Every year. In the late 70s and early 80s, he went almost every year. That slowed down later. But he would bring the paintings to me in New York. He was living in New York as well. And I began to learn who the artists were and see the evolution of their work, which for me was fascinating. I'd been to India many times on other projects, but I'd never been to Madhubani. I'd never seen any of the artists. I was simply in New York, and I would help him put on exhibitions and sales at the meetings and conferences and anything that had to do with South Asia, where people would be interested in the art. We even put on an exhibition in the Women's Bank. There was a Women's Bank formerly organized in New York City. And we had an exhibition at the Women's Bank thinking that women would be interested in women's paintings. It didn't work. They were only interested in their money. They didn't have any interest in the art, even though it was up on the walls. But we tried a lot of places to put the exhibitions out. What we had to do, however, was to create a foundation or create an institution to which people could make their payments. We didn't want people to give him a check or give me a check for a painting, because then it gets caught up in our taxes. We would have to pay tax on that as income. We didn't want to do that. So we went to a lawyer friend, and he did all the paperwork to establish the Ethnic Arts Foundation legally as an IRS, an Internal Revenue Service approved not-for-profit organization, so that we could tell people, if you want to buy a painting, make the check out to the Ethnic Arts Foundation and we'd put the check in that account, and it didn't sort of get involved with our taxes. what we would do, literally, was every time that Ray was about to leave for India, we would take all the money out, leave $1 in the account, give him everything else that was in the account, and he would then use that to buy the next round of paintings and to pay the what became known as the feedback paintings, the feedback payments, that second payment. The second payment was enormously both popular and important because it documented, it demonstrated to the artists that they would, if they did really good work, they would get a substantial sum. He might pay, say, 100 rupees for a painting for the artist, but when we sold it for 100, well, in those days, about $150 was the highest price. They would get another $125 in rupees, which would be, I've forgotten the exchange rate at that point, but it was far more than the 100 rupees that he had initially paid them. And so there was an economic interest in doing your good best work. One, because you got the first payment, and then two, you might well get the second payment. He also bought paintings on several criteria. One was paintings that were just so brilliant that he was absolutely sure they would be sold, that we would find a buyer for them. He also bought paintings in instances where he thought the person had a great deal of talent, but really needed encouragement. And we might be able to sell the painting, or we might not be able to sell the painting in the American market. But he was willing to invest in people to encourage them, and because they would still get the 100 rupees payment up front, more than they would get from a dealer. But we couldn't assure them that they were going to get a second payment later on. People understood that. And appreciated the fact that he was encouraging them and trying to get them up to the state where they could actually get the second payment as well. But he didn't tell people what to paint. He made it very clear that they had to paint things, they should be painting things, which, as I said, meant a lot to them personally, something that they cared about. And that was a phrase he used over and over, something you care about. Whether it's a family or a god or a goddess or an illness or some event in the community. It could be anything that a story that you like to tell your children, whatever it is, but something that you care about. That led fairly quickly to encouraging people to tell stories, to do narrative paintings, which of course had never been done when the paintings were on walls, because they were there mostly for ritual purposes. And people would not tell long stories on the walls of their houses. So that was an innovation, but it was something which people began to find they couldn't cram all of the details of the story onto a single piece of paper, 22 by 30 inches. In some cases, they got larger pieces of paper, but very often they would do a series of paintings, separate paintings, telling one episode after another of a story. Dulari Davey was famous for that. She picked up that idea, and she produced, Ray purchased, I think, 6 different long stories that she knew, folk tales that she knew and she liked. And she did 18 to 22 paintings to tell the whole story. We still have a few of them. We still have, I think, 3 of those stories left. Christian Anjal was a special case as well. He was or at that time, he was the one active male painter. There was others that come along since then. most of the painters were, of course, women, and most of the paintings still are women. Krishnanand Jha had been was from a tantric family, but he went to Calcutta for a bachelor's degree in economics, as I recall, and finished his degree in Calcutta, but he couldn't get a job. He couldn't find a job. Excuse me. And he ended up, at sort of Ray's suggestion, doing his own life history in paintings, in 6 paintings, including one showing him kneeling at the edge of the Ganges in Calcutta and tearing up his diploma that he had received because he said it was useless. He couldn't get a job even with a diploma. And went back to his village just outside of Madhubani town, and in effect apprenticed himself to his father, who was no longer an active tantric priest, but knew a lot about tantrism. And Krishnanand Jha then went on painting tantric images over the course of his life, and he produced hundreds of extraordinary paintings, tantric paintings of gods and goddesses and their yantras, and some paintings of the Ramayana as well. When the women began painting, there were few who did these stories, long stories, the way Bawa Devi did, but Shanti Devi was another one who started doing paintings of the stories around Raja Salhesh. One of the interesting things about the development of the painting tradition is that initially it was based in the Brahmin and Kayastic communities. The other caste within and jati within Madhubani didn't paint, or so Archer, the British colonial official who first discovered the paintings back in the 1930s, or so he thought. He said, the other castes don't paint, or if they do, it's just derivative. It isn't important. He paid no attention to the work of the other castes. He was only interested in the Brahmin and the Kayas paintings. But in fact, the Dusad community was doing painting, and they were also doing very interesting wall reliefs, mud reliefs on their homes, which are often quite striking and quite beautiful. And a woman by the name of Erika Moser, a German woman who's an anthropologist and a folklorist, worked with the Dusad and encouraged them to develop their own painting tradition because they obviously had a strong aesthetic capacity. And Shanti Devi was one of the first who actually started working in from the Dusad community, who began painting actively. And she did dozens of paintings of different episodes in the life of Raja Salhesh, who was the culture hero of the Dusad community. So that she wasn't doing a narrative in the same way that Bawa Devi was telling the story from sequence to sequence to sequence, but Shanti Devi would do just the various episodes in the life of Raja Salhesh. So, but again, it was a long series of paintings. Ray encouraged this. He didn't say you should do this, but he said, if you want to do this, I'll buy the paintings, and which was in effect an encouragement. And so you had different kinds of streams. Some people doing individual paintings, some people telling stories, some people producing episodes, as often people did of the Ramayana. People would take particular scenes of the Ramayana, Ram and Sita leaving the palace, and Lakshman leaving the palace, going into the forest, or Sita garlanding Ram, or Ravana capturing Sita, or specific events within the Ramayana. But they weren't telling the whole story. They weren't attempting to do that the way Devi would do with her narratives. So there were different multiple painting narrative traditions operating simultaneously, and he would encourage them all. Gopal Saha, one of the other male painters in the tradition, did a series of stories as well, ranging from local folk tales about a lazy shoemaker. He told a story there about six paintings, and telling the story of the lazy shoemaker. Two classic stories like Shakuntala, things that would be known across the country. So there was a lot of storytelling. There's a strong narrative tradition in the area. People know lots of stories, and the stories became another source of paintings. It wasn't until Ray went back to India, to Madhubani, 10 times, in 77, 78, 70, in 80, 81, 83, 84, in 88. And then there was a long gap until 99. He went back in 1999, stayed for 6 months on that occasion, and came back to the US, and died he came back in March, and he died in June of heart failure. At that point, well, I should just insert one other thing that I forgot to mention. While he was in Madhubani, while he was going back and forth, and especially in the later years, he got to know very well Santosh Kumar Das. There were times that he stayed with Santosh for weeks at a time. I stayed with him at his home. But Santosh became a close friend. And Santosh had recently returned, or in the early 90s, had returned from Baroda, and having a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Baroda, which was then the top art school in the country. And Santosh was again someone who had enormous artistic skill, and still does. I shouldn't put him in the past tense. And he was concerned with bringing Mithila painting into the modern world. He wanted Mithila painting to be seen as a fine art. He wanted to develop Mithila painting into something more than a folk art. That was why he came back from Baroda to Granti, his village, to work on this project he had, making Mithila painting a fine art rather than just a folk art. And he and Ray obviously fell together very nicely around that kind of concern. Fortunately, not only was Santosh committed to that, he was a very fine artist, and when he took some people as students, even when he was in that mode, but not many. But when Ray died in 2000, it appeared that the Ethnic Arts Foundation was at an end. This process would end because he was the one who was going back and forth and seeing and dealing with the painters. It wasn't until 15 months after Ray died that Joseph Elder, who was a professor at the University of Michigan, who was a close friend of Ray's and mine, who was operating as the treasurer of the Ethnic Arts Foundation, got a phone call from a lawyer in Brooklyn, New York, saying that Ray had left some money in his will to continue doing what the Ethnic Arts Foundation had been doing. He had never told any of us. We had no idea that Ray was leaving any money or that he had any money. It turned out he had money because he had bought an old building in New York and wanted to fix it up. And it never got fixed up. And when he died, the building was sold, and he had designated 20% of the funds from the sale of that old building for the Ethnic Arts Foundation. So once again, Ray supported the Ethnic Arts Foundation. That resulted when we learned that, in fact, there was some money to continue doing what he had been doing. Joe Elder and I, and a man named Parmeshwar Jha, who had been working with us. Ray didn't speak Mithili, and I certainly didn't speak Mithili. But Parmeshwar Jha was living in New Jersey. He was a professor of economics at Rutgers University. And whenever anything came along that was in Mithili, or in Hindi for that matter, Parmeshwar could handle it and translate it to those of us who weren't adept in the languages. And he became a very close friend of ours. His son, his older son, has now become a very famous public health official, and he's on television almost every night talking about how to deal with the coronavirus. This is Parmeshwar's son. Parmeshwar and I and Ray were close buddies. We were spending a lot of time together. In December of 2002, 2001, 2002, Parmeshwar and I and Joe Elder, the three of us, went to Madhubani, spent 2 weeks there at the time, telling people that Ray had left his money and that we would continue doing what he had been doing, buying paintings, putting on exhibitions, selling as many as we could, and returning the proceeds, the profits, to the artists. The exact same procedure that Ray had been doing. But we also asked the artists at that time, this is December 2001, January 2002, what else we might do. Were there other things that would be useful for the Ethnic Arts Foundation to do? And what came back to us from the artists was this fear and complaint that the younger generation of women were no longer interested in learning how to paint from their mothers or their aunties or their grandmothers or the older women in their families or in the community. A few were, but not very many. And the older artists, many of whom had already died, Ganga Devi had died long before. Sita Devi, at that time when we were there, had already gone blind and was very bitter about the fact that she couldn't paint anymore and couldn't take students anymore. The artist said, the tradition is going to die. There's the dealers had come back and were paying paltry sums again, and are not paying them at all, or taking paintings and then not returning the price. They were very upset, and so we asked if the young women are no longer interested in learning from their mothers. Did they think that an art school would be a useful way of training young people? And the response was, well, it never occurred to them to have an art school. That wasn't an institution that was in anybody's mind. But I had been to art school. I thought at one point in my life I was going to be a sculptor. So I'd been going to art school. So I knew something about art schools. And I raised this question, and they said, well, I don't know, maybe it would last for a year or two or three. But we said, well, we'll try it, because we had the money that Ray had left. We could start something small, something new. And we turned in that instance to Santosh Kumar Das. Santosh was very energetic, very lively, and very demanding of his in his approach to work being taken seriously, because he wanted it to become a fine art. And we set up the Mithila Art Institute with him as the first director. The key to the school was the blind entrance test that Parmeshwar devised. Parmeshwar, being Madhubani, he had grown up in Madhubani. He knew the place very well. His father had organized, I think, 5 high schools in the area. His father was a lawyer, but also an educator. Parmeshwar was and is a very intelligent and savvy guy. And he created an entrance exam for the school, which runs as follows. Announcements go around to all the villages in the surrounding area that the school was going to have an entrance exam on a particular day. It was then, at that point, it was in February. They would say, people, anyone interested in attending the school should bring with them whatever paints or inks or brushes or means of painting that they were interested in using, that they had felt comfortable with. And when they arrived at the school at the appointed hour, which is usually around 10 o'clock in the morning, as I recall, Kaushik Jha, who was Parmeshwar's nephew, his brother's son, who was served as the administrator of the school, put down everyone's name, all the applicants' names in a book, and each one of them had a number attached to them, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and Kaushik would give that each student a piece of paper about, well, I guess it was 10, 15, probably 15 by 20 inches large. Not a big piece of paper, a small piece of paper, with the instruction that they should sit down and have the next 4 hours to do a painting on that piece of paper, that numbered piece of paper. There was no name on the paper, there was just a number. And there was people, the first year that we did this, I was there for that one. 113 people showed up. I think there were 111 young women and 2 young men showed up to take the test. And at the end of 4 hours, we gave them 4 hours to do whatever they wanted on that piece of paper. We then collected all of the pieces of paper and turned them over to a panel, which included Shanti Davey and Baba Davey, and I've forgotten who the others were, but there were 5 artists, and said, where do you see talent? Where among all of these papers? And what happened was that very quickly there were 10 or 12 or 15 paintings that were obviously so good that people obviously had a lot of talent. And then there were probably 30 or 50 or 75 paintings which really weren't very good. Didn't look like the painter had talent. And then there were a few to argue about. There was some people said, yes, well, this student has some talent, or this applicant has some talent. And others said, no, they don't. But we told them that we needed. All we could take was 25, and then a couple of alternates. And so the panel of artists, without knowing who the students were, just all they knew was from the identities was the number. They knew, but they didn't know who the numbers corresponded to. And the point was to make sure that the selection was entirely on observable talent, rather than on who's member, who's a niece or a nephew of someone, or who's a friend of someone, or who's connected in one way or another through family or through politics. Talent was going to be the sole criterion for selection. And we continued using precisely that system until the closure for all 16 years. Every year we would have this kind of competition. And the second year, it was over 300. I think it was 303 young people showed up. Again, almost entirely young women, but often 2 or 3 or 4 young men would come as well. We had a kind of a vague criterion that it should be people who are over 15 and probably under 25 years old. So it was for young people to get young people excited about doing that. Santosh then became the director. There was a board of directors made up of artists. Parmesan was made it a point of having artists on the board from each of the major communities in Madhubani. Brahmin, Kayas, Dusad, and several others, and a retired professor of Sanskrit, and a judge. But all of them were sort of scattered across the spectrum of the caste, so that this wasn't sort of seen to be, and it really wasn't, captured by a particular community. It didn't belong to one community. It was open to everybody. At first, most of the artists did come from the Brahmin and Kayas communities. Those are the ones which painting had been sort of publicly done for several decades. Over time, what was interesting was how the caste backgrounds, the jati backgrounds of the artists expanded. It turned out there was just as much talent in all of a lot of talent among young people across the border, across all the communities. The school was free. It was totally free. Everything was provided. Materials, space, the paper, the paints, the ink, the etc. And for students who were coming from villages some distance away, they would have their travel reimbursed every day. So it really didn't cost them anything to come to the school. Kaushik and Santosh made it very clear that this was 5 days a week, 4 hours a day. You come on time, you come every day. If you don't come every day, or you don't have a proper excuse, you get thrown out, and they'll put in one of the alternates to take your place. This is a serious school. This is, and Santosh at the same time began saying over and over again what Ray had been saying: do paintings that you are excited about, that you're interested in, about issues that you're concerned with. He also, though, did a lot of teaching about what attributes go with what figures in the tradition. What stories would be seem to be of interest, like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and Shakuntala and Harishchandra, etc. And then people added their own stories. And obviously, The students brought with them stories that they had been reading in school or hearing at home. And because they were working on things which they really cared about, and Santosh really pushed this, they paid a lot of attention to what they did. They worked very seriously. This was a very serious art school. Very modest quarters. It was just a long building that had been designed to be a hotel, and we just grabbed, or sorry, Parmesan grabbed one floor of the building, and it had a bathroom and a little office, and it was an empty floor, and we set in tables. So it was very simple. It had no fancy equipment or no equipment at all other than the tables and the materials. And eventually we developed a library for books, both about Indian art, about Mithila art, and about some foreign art. Once in a while, we'd throw in a book from European art or Japanese art, something like that. But basically, it was a serious working setting, and people came from different communities because it wasn't all just friends who came together, but they all had one thing in common. They were all interested in art. And one of the interesting differences that the school made was that they could see each other's work.
Right.
Traditionally, artists were very skeptical about allowing anyone else to see their art. They would show it to Ray because he would buy it or might buy it. On the other hand, they didn't want other people, as they often said this to me, they didn't want other people stealing their ideas. In the context of the open school, everyone could see what everyone else was doing, and they learned from each other. And Santosh really encouraged that, and encouraged people to use their imagination. Think of things that are implausible. A flight to the moon. One of his exercises for the painters was to do a painting of a five-headed cow. A five-headed cow.
Okay.
And this forced people to imagine what would a five-headed cow look like. How would you
Yes.
depict that? And that tradition, Santosh was very strong teaching for the first 4 years. Fifth year, he began to realize he was losing time on his own art. And we invited Dulari Davey, who had just returned to Narayani, to work with Santosh. And she picked up that tradition, and she taught for the next 5 years. And then there have been a whole series of teachers of that sort. But we maintained the tradition that this is a place for serious work and work that you really care about. And I then became the person who would come every year, and I went every year from 2003 up until 2018. I didn't get there in 19, that was the last year. And played the role that Ray did of purchasing paintings. And I'm still in the process of selling the paintings and just sending them all the money now back to the artists. It doesn't come to me. The Ethnic Arts Foundation is no longer selling paintings. What we are doing with the paintings that are left over that we haven't been able to sell, we're beginning to donate them to museums and universities where they want to have collections of the paintings, and building the general knowledge of the painting tradition through creating collections in universities and museums. And that's where we are now. Maybe I can.
Okay.
And you can.
We have a presentation also, right, from your side? So would you like to talk about that presentation?
Are you referring to Aditi?
Aditi is here.
Yes.
But would you like to present that PPT
Oh,
you had sent to me?
The painting, surely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, just a sec. After this presentation, we will start some question answers.
Okay. Mhm.
Yeah, here it is.
Okay, now I can. Starting with Ganesh, always a good place to start.
Yeah.
This is a painting by Dulari Davey. She does lots of Ganeshas. It's a popular issue for her. But as you will, and she's from the Fisher community, talking about how there is a tremendous artistic skill scattered all across the society, not just in the upper castes. Uh, she's from the Fisher community, has no education whatsoever. When I first met her, uh, she was working as a domestic for Karpuri Devi. Uh, and Karpuri Devi recognized that Dulari was serious about art, gave her some lessons, and lo and behold, Dulari has now been teaching at the school. She's been one of the major teachers at the school, and she was commissioned by Madhubani to paint the monument in the center of the town. Uh, she speaks no English, and she for a long time couldn't read or write, but she's published her own. She published the first autobiography of of a Mithila painter with her paintings rather than with text. Sita Devi was. This is one of the paintings like the ones that Ray first showed me. I don't have any more of those. Those got sold a long time ago, but this is the quality of the work that I saw when I fell in love with the paintings back in when Ray first showed them to me. They're just stunningly beautiful. This is a photograph from 1940. Uh, the British colonial official W.G. Archer photographed um, during the 1930s and up until 1940 wall paintings, which became the basis for the paintings on paper in the 1960s. This is just one showing the enormous aesthetic capacity. Archer saw paintings like this and said, literally, he wrote about them saying, oh, this is Picasso, this is Clay, this is Leger. He immediately recognized in these wall paintings European equivalents of them, and that they were these paintings themselves were the equivalent of what was being produced in Europe at that time. And he was a very highly educated Cambridge student. He studied art history, and he saw in these paintings an enormous capacity. This is another one of the wall paintings that he photographed. The photographs themselves are all in the British Library. I had copies of them made. This is the first painting that I'd ever seen of a. Whoops, go back. Can I go back into that?
Yeah.
There we go. Of a Cobar, the marriage painting. This is the lotus pond, which represents the bride, the beauty of the bride, and the fertility of the bride. The fish are fertility symbols. This is the bamboo, the bonds, which represents the groom or the groom himself and or the family of the groom, the family line of the groom. And they were sort of the core image of the major event of a marriage. And it has become a constant figure in the tradition, done by the artists frequently. I have photographs of about must be 160 different Cobars. They all have the same basic elements, some of them more elaborated than others, and we'll come to that in a moment. But
That's great.
what it looked like. Whoops, that's not doing what I wanted to do. That's this is a painting by Shanti Devi of Raja Salhesh. I mentioned earlier on that she herself is a Dusad, a very bright and lively woman, and she did a whole series of paintings about Raja Salhesh. This is Salhesh on the elephant over here, and this is his brother, and this is there's two of his other companions. She would do paintings of this sort, and lots and lots of them, and she's made quite a name for herself nationally. Okay. This is from Pari Devi. Did a lot of village scenes, and this was a scene of the village potter, and it's remarkably accurate. I've spent a little bit of time with the village potter and seen this very scene with the pots all over and the figure on the lower right actually making the pots, turning the wheel. This is an early painting. Urmila Devi, again, a Dusad, and this painting really represents a bit of social commentary because what she has done is paint the tree of life, but into the branches of the tree of life are the tents and the corrals of the migrant laborers who pass through the area at harvest time and do the help with the harvesting for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and then move on to the next villages and the next villages where there's agricultural labor to be done. And she's doing a painting of sort of the actual life of the community and an element of what's going on in the community. She's still a very active painter. This is another painting by Dulari Davey. It's one that excited me a great deal because as it says, the flood in Ranti. This is the 2008 flood in Ranti village where she lives. And she said what happened in the flood was that the rich family went off in a boat with a boatman, having locked up their house in the upper right corner, while the poor people were pulling dead bodies out of the waters and were mourning for the dead. This is the rich could escape the flood, but the poor had to deal with death. This sounded very much like the great disaster in the United States and in New Orleans at about the same time, after Hurricane Katrina, in which the rich people escaped the flood in their SUVs and the poor people drowned and had to deal with death. She was seeing it in her own village, and she was commenting on the disparity in the capacity of the rich to escape the tragedy and the poor people to have to suffer the tragedy. And it's a dramatic painting. This is a painting by one of the students at the school. They began commenting on what's going on in the world around them as well. And this is another flood picture, and it shows the people in the water trying to survive in the water with all kinds of other objects in there. A helicopter dropping food packages, guys up in the trees, and in the upper right corner, the bureaucrats sitting talking about what we should do in the safety of their offices. She said that the real world goes on while the bureaucrats simply talk. And we can go on to the next One. A similar painting, different artist, treating a fire in the village. Again, what she's showing is people gathering water in the lower right corner and with buckets and running to the fire in the upper left corner, while and people in distress down below because some of the village is burning. While at the same time, in the upper right corner, the firemen are just filling the fire truck with water. They're too late. He said the fire brigade comes too late. It never gets there on time to deal with the fire. This kind of not so gentle criticism of the bureaucracy started coming out in the paintings. Next.
Yes.
There we go. This was there about several years ago. There was a lot of talk about corruption in the government, and this is a painting which very quickly sort of envisioned the corruption. The first is in the upper left. You get a truck paying a policeman to go into a no entry zone. To the right, you have a teacher at school reading the newspaper, and the students on their cell phones, and very few students have even bothered to come. On the lower left, you have people lined up to get tickets at the train station, but there's no clerk to give them the ticket, even though it's now 11:30 in the morning. And on the lower right, you have a man coming to pay for an abortion, which is, of course, illegal as well. And they were saying that this is what's going on now. This is an interesting painting of one of the earliest paintings that I've seen of a feminist mode in which the wife is seen as the beast of burden. The wife is the elephant who does all the work, but is ridden by a man. And then around the outside is the full life cycle of a woman, from her birth in the lower left corner, going all the way around to childhood, marriage, and being ultimately thrown out of the family and dying at the end. But it's an extraordinary account of what a woman goes through. This is the abortion clinic done by Ronnie Jha, which shows a woman on a gurney on the left-hand side, attached to a ultrasound up above, and it turns out that the fetus is a female, and her mother-in-law is telling her that she has to abort, where her daughter down below the gurney is begging her mother not to abort what would be her sister. The doctor is coiled up in a snake, a naga, with 5 little girls in her coils that she's already aborted. She is in medical gown. The 2 women behind her are also nurses in sort of modern medical gowns, whereas the mother-in-law who's telling her daughter-in-law that she has to abort is in a very traditional gown. She's talking about modernity and tradition and the continuation of abortion going on, despite the fact, of course, that it's illegal. We can go on. This is a painting that is quite amazing. One of the traditions of the painting tradition is to allow you to look inside houses. They take the front wall off the house. You see many paintings do this. What you're seeing here is a husband pouring kerosene on his wife, who is kneeling down below, and his mother, the mother-in-law of the bride is lighting a match to set her on fire. What you also see, though, is a group of women outside the house, and one of them coming in, protesting what's going on inside the house, saying that's not to be done. In addition to which, there's a woman in the window who is pouring kerosene on the mother-in-law's head, and the woman coming up behind the mother-in-law is carrying a match to light the mother-in-law on fire rather than have the bride be burned. This is a very dramatic image. I saw this painting when it was almost finished, and I asked the artist if that had ever happened, that a protest had taken place and the mother-in-law had been burned instead. And she looked up at me and she said, no, but it should. More interesting feminist paintings. This painting actually begins in the middle of the scene. The two women in a cage. The traditionally dressed woman is totally inside the cage. The more modern dressed woman is stepping out of the cage. She's breaking out. The traditional woman up in the upper left corner is living domestically. She's cooking food, and below that she's under the control of her mother-in-law, cleaning dishes. The modern woman, you see at the bottom, goes to school, and she has at least two alternatives. In the upper right, she's learning how to use a computer. I'm sure he is using a computer. And in the lower right, she's become a policewoman, and she's captured a thief who's stolen someone's bag. The contrast is being made between the modern world and the traditional world. Here we have Rani Jha's painting, which was unlike anything I had ever seen. It's a curtain with eyes peering through, and then in the middle, there are a group of women who are breaking through the curtain. And she said, women in the past, it could only peer from behind the curtain when visitors came, when outsiders came. They couldn't participate in the active world. Now we are joining together and we're breaking through the curtain. This painting is currently in a traveling exhibition, which is going around right now around the US. It's been to 7 or 8 different places, along with the abortion clinic. Both of these paintings are in that same exhibition, along with many others. This is a painting by Kamlesh, one of the young men who went to the school. It's significant for its physical beauty. It's an astonishingly beautiful painting of a sunrise over a tree of life, with fish and down below and birds and the flowers. It's representative of the fact that the critical paintings that you've seen so far all have been done by women. The young men tend to paint beautiful scenes, but they're not critical scenes. The world is, for a young man in Madhubani, there are more opportunities. He's freer to move around. He's less constrained about getting married right away, and he's just has a lot more freedom. And they have many fewer complaints on their minds. There are fewer issues, and you'll see that again and again in the men's paintings. We go on to the next one. This is Pratik's painting, just called "Girl Fishing." He said he was traveling on a jeep, and he saw a young girl, just fishing in a pond, and it embedded in his mind as something, just a beautiful scene. And he went home and quickly sketched it and then painted it. This one is by one of the Paswan, one of the Dalit painters. It's an abstract, almost an abstract painting. If you look close, there are fish at the bottom, or running up the tree, and there are peacocks along the side of both sides of the tree, and the leaves of an adjacent tree are coming in from nearby. This painting was immediately bought by the museum, the San Francisco Museum, Asian Art Museum, as an extraordinary abstract painting, or semi-abstract and semi-imaginative painting. And this is coming from the Dusad community, the Dalit community. This is what became of that Cobar. You saw the very simple one on the wall at the very beginning. Godavari Datta has become now in her 90s sort of the dean of the traditional paintings. She's a marvelous painter, but she does very traditional images. This is on the wall of her home, and she uses it for teaching how to do a proper Cobar with all of the different symbols involved. And she will insist that that's what it should look like. This is a painting of a Cobar by one of the younger artists, saying essentially, marriage can turn out to be a trap. What you see here is a Cobar in the center, but the bride is now veiled in a naga, in a snake, and the groom is walking out already. He's leaving the bride, and she has broken dishes at the feet, at the bottom, and there are bird cages at the top, representing the confinement which wives traditionally found. This is another Cobar. In this case, the figure of the Cobar has been transformed into a series of kalashes, which are very important in a wedding. But the groom, the bonds, is up in the upper right in a kalash. The lower left is Shiva and Parvati, who are in the kalash. Gauri Puja is taking place in the lower right in a kalash. But in the upper left, there's the bride and groom holding hands. This is a call for love marriages rather than arranged marriage. The couple, there ought to be love marriages instead of just excuse me, arranged marriages. So the artists are using the traditional materials to now deal with contemporary issues in a very powerful way. That's still 10 or 15% of the production. Most of the paintings are still standard Cobars or standard images of gods and goddesses or scenes from the Ramayana. But there's this growing trend of taking on what's on the minds of the young artists as in their own lives. That's what's being produced now.
Thank you for the detailed presentation. Yes, Aditi.
Yes, sir. Thank you, David, sir. It was like very chronological way you've explained from its inception to discovery to the proliferation, every stage wise. So there are a few questions I would like to ask you. So while you was talking about so Mithila painting, while you were talking about, is there a specific theme like you were looking for? Like how do you decipher which painting belongs to which section, or what is a good painting, bad painting, best painting? Was this particular theme? And second is like, did you see a transition in the theme? Like as you showed right now in the PPT, there was a huge transition.
Yes.
So how would you see that transition? Like how could you like?
There are two different questions there. That on the transition, it was evident as I would go every year, and what I would see in the first few years was paintings of gods and goddesses, and occasional paintings from the Ramayana. and they were very similar to the paintings that had been done by the major artists back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Over time, and I think this was very much the influence of Santosh Kumar Das, an encouragement that sure you can do those paintings, and you should know how to do those paintings of the traditional subjects. But think about things in your own life that matter to you personally, and that's when the young women began to do paintings which were about marriage, about growing up under constraint. There's a image of a parrot in a cage, which became very prevalent, for example, as representing the role of the wife. The role of the wife. She's trapped in a cage. The one showing the modern woman and the traditional woman, the painting that I showed a little while ago, is sort of an instance of that. But there are many paintings with a parrot in a cage representing the life of a woman and the need to break out of that somewhat. That began to really emerge in the last part of Santosh's reign, and it's grown ever since as a symbol. The world events became interesting to women. The earthquake in Japan, the tsunami in Sri Lanka, the earthquake in Nepal, all of these events, the airplane crashes in Europe, suddenly become things on the mind of people, and when they're struck by, or pained by, or troubled by, or aware of, and they try to capture what's going on in the larger world. In other words, the imagination of the artists, and the fact that the media is getting better. TV. When I first went there was practically no TV at all in Madhubani. Now, of course, there are dozens of channels and lots of images. So people are much more aware of what's going on in the rest of the world, not just in India. So that there's just been an enormous expansion in the repertoire, and every time I've gone, I've been surprised at something new that I had never seen before. One of the other paintings that you didn't see was an image of the palace of Lord Buddha. The image, you see him as a young man in the palace. You see him leaving the palace. You see him being born first in from his mother's hip, and you see him in the palace. You see him leave, and then he comes back as a woman, and he's seated under she is now seated under the tree, and the Buddha has become a woman. I asked the artist about this, and she said, "Well, the idea of the Buddha is not just male; it's just as much female as male. There's no reason why the Buddha can't be a woman." And the people are increasingly aware that there was in Madhubani a strong tradition of Buddhism back in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. There's still archaeological ruins of Buddhist materials that are being found all the time in museums, and people are aware of that. And so Buddhism has become a new issue in the tradition. Whether that has anything to do with the anti-Hindutva movement, I don't know. I don't think it does in that sense.
But still, it is not very much prominent in Mithila painting. Buddhism is not very much prominent.
No, it's not. But
no, it's not.
Picking it up now and quite a few of them have done paintings of the Buddha in various stages of his life.
But say you mentioned like you have worked with Dusads and the past ones. So Dusads, basically, they're the Dalits of that area.
Yeah.
So because there was a conversion of Dusads because they could not align to the Brahminical structure and they never had access to the painting of Ramayana, Ram Sita.
Right.
So could you see that one of the reasons that there was a transition in the theme to Lord Buddha just particular to this community of Dusads, or as according to you, it would be like the people from Brahmins or Kayas used to do it?
I have never seen a painting of the Buddha from the Dusad community.
Okay.
They have not. It's been coming from the Brahmins and the Kayas community. In fact.
Okay.
But I have seen some paintings from the Sad community, and even Shanti Devi was also painting Buddha, Lord Buddha.
Really, that may be. I have not. I've obviously not seen all the paintings, but I've never seen a Buddha painting from the Dusad. The Dusad paintings of Raja Salhesh are very interesting, though, because over time he is developing more and more characteristics that make him look like Krishna.
Right.
The Krishna, I don't think Raja Salhesh started out as a Krishna-like figure, but he's frequently shown in a ras kind of formation, for example. But instead of Krishna in the middle, it's Raja Salhesh in the middle. And he has the capacity to turn himself into many creatures to please other people around him, which, of course, Krishna can do with his gopis. So there's.
Okay, contrary to this question, actually, what Aditi had asked right now, there is a question. I was going through your paper, and you had mentioned that Mithila Art Institute had emphasis in their curriculum on classic Mathil aesthetics and iconography. What does it mean, actually?
I'm sorry, that I had in focus.
I read your paper actually, which you had sent to me. That was a brief history of EAF and Mithila Art Institute. And in that paper, actually, I found few lines stating Mithila Art Institute had emphasis in their curriculum on classic Mathil aesthetics and iconography. What does it mean, actually? Is it a Brahminical iconography, or in totality?
It's what I intended by that was a combination of imagery of the gods and goddesses, which is common on the walls on the wall paintings. The image of the Cobar and the details of the Cobar, and there's one other. Oh, and the Ramayana. Though in fact, the Ramayana, although enormously popular in Sita, is much beloved in the tradition. I recently went through all of the Archer photographs. There were about 250 of them. And out of the 250 paintings, wall paintings that he photographed, or that are available through the British Library, I don't know how many pictures he ultimately took. There's only one small image of Ram and Sita. It was the Ramayana was not a popular image in the tradition, but at the time that the school was set up, it had become part of the repertoire of the painters in the 70s and 80s and 90s. They were doing paintings of the Ramayana, and the students have picked those up. But it's the Ramayana, the Cobar, and the gods and goddesses: Shiva, Parvati, Krishna, Radha Krishna, and so forth. Ganesh, Rama, the standard Hindu cosmology. That's
Aditi.
And their attributes. Rani Jha would talk about you can't do a painting of Shiva with a bow and arrow. That's wrong. Bow and arrow belongs to Ram. Shiva has snakes and has the Ganges coming from her head, his hair. You have to get these basic things right, the basic characteristics right. And
But the depiction of Raja Salhes in the form of Rasa was actually identical to the Rasa of Krishna, right?
very similar, very similar. I don't know whether they were copying it or it was just an idea in their head, but there's an effort, I think, on the part of the Dulari community to say, our gods are just like your gods. Our God, we may be Dalits, but we are human beings like you, and we have gods like you, and they're being like you and carrying some of the same characteristics.
Yeah. Sir, you were talking a lot about the logistics and so I this particular questions like you used to take, so you have a really nice collection. So there was a nexus of brokerage which is working at the national in Bihar. You used to take the paintings, basically the foundation used to take the paintings, go and present it in the international market through exhibitions, and then EAF was working on this kind of a model. So how would you could you please just throw some light on the pricing detail? Like how would you do the pricing, and how would you decipher how do you decipher a cost of an art piece?
Well, on pricing, or in the selection of paintings more generally, um, one thing that I would look for, just as Ray did, is paintings which we thought we could imagine would be saleable in the United States, because we wanted to be able to, or overseas. In more recent years, we've had exhibitions and sales in France, a lot of them in France, and a little bit in South Africa, where I spend a lot of time. We even had an exhibition in Iceland, where they sold a lot of. For Iceland, for example, I chose a lot of paintings with fish in them because I knew fish is a central issue in Iceland, and that people would find paintings with fish in them attractive and interesting. And indeed, they all got sold out. That was a very successful exhibition. And that was about 45 or 50 paintings from many different artists. So one of the things that I look for is, can I imagine someone in the United States being interested in this painting? So it means they have to have either some knowledge of the Indian world, Indian culture, or that it's self-evident in the painting, or something which is readily explainable when they look at the painting. Someone can, a label can tell them, or I could tell them, Ray could tell them what's going on in it. That was one thing. The second thing was simply the quality of the hand, the care with which the painting was done, the detail, the level of detail. One of the things that Santosh taught, and everyone else has taught since then, when you draw a line, the line should be clear and smooth and fine, and the line next to it shouldn't smudge into it. It shouldn't cross over it, unless you intentionally do that in order to cross hatching. But that this real care is taken in producing the image. Care is thoughtfulness is taken in terms of the color that you use, the colors that you mix together. It's this. You look at a painting and you can tell that this was sort of snapbash, or this was something that somebody really worked on very carefully. And people work a long time on individual paintings. It often takes them for several weeks, a month, to complete a painting, even if they're working pretty much full time. People work slowly and very carefully on the paintings, and that shows up. And people appreciate that as well. Buyers appreciate that.
Sir, when you introduce a piece of art in the market, and as you mentioned in Iceland, the main emphasis was given to the fishes because the Iceland is their culture is different. Don't you think that would dilute the exact existence of our folk culture, art folk, art Mithila? Like was it just to satiate the market need, or did you maintain that essence of it being a part of Indian cultural heritage from Bihar?
Well, there are a lot of fish paintings, I could show you dozens of paintings.
Of course, yeah.
Fish are very important in the culture, and it didn't distort them. And people, the paintings that I bought were paintings which had already been done. I didn't tell people we're having an exhibition in Iceland. I didn't know about it at the time. But when I knew that there was an exhibition in Iceland, I said, "All right, I'll see if I can find some paintings with fish in them." And it wasn't hard to do. They were there already, and they came mostly from the senior artists, not from students at the school. The fish are symbols of fertility and fecundity and well-being, so that it was a normal, natural symbol in the tradition. Pricing. What we did at school initially was to say, if we're going to, any work of art done at the school, in effect belongs to the school, was done at the school, but we would offer, if we wanted to purchase a painting, we would offer to pay 2,000 rupees for that painting. That was the flat price. And then later on, we increased it to 3,000 rupees, so that the students knew that if they did a painting that I thought was a solid painting and that was plausible to the outside world, whether in France or in Germany or in the US, wherever, or could be readily explained, that would give them an initial 2,000, or as I said later, 3,000 rupees immediate response. We sold the painting then for $100. They would get another, say, $60 or $70 worth of rupees again on top of the 2,000 or 3,000 they got. So there was a real economic motive of doing something which was carefully done in an interesting image. We didn't tell them what to paint, and a lot of the vast majority of the paintings at the school were in fact very traditional subjects of gods and goddesses. The critiques that I showed you were one interesting branch off, where people are using the tradition to deal with other issues and going on.
Do you have any memoir of the gallery when you and Ray approaches to a gallery? Then how the gallery was reacting actually with those paintings?
We have one or two cases from Ray's time. Very unfortunate thing. Ray's wife, Naomi, died. She had a long bout with cancer and eventually died in 1997. She was very ill for a long time. And after she died, in 2 years later, Ray married another woman, a nurse. But it was a bad marriage, and they didn't get on very well. And all of Ray's papers were thrown out by his second wife when he died. Everything, all of his books, his papers, and the records of the Ethnic Arts Foundation, because he remained as the president of the foundation. And so he had all of the financial records and the materials. I've ended up with photographs of the paintings from that period, and some of the paintings that were left over. She didn't throw away the paintings. She gave them to Joe Elder, and Joe Elder passed them to me. But all of the written materials that I didn't receive, or letters that I kept the letters that I got from Ray, but there's a big gap in the early history, because she literally, it was a bitter event. The marriage ended bitterly, and she literally threw away everything. So the files are very complete since 2000, 2003, but there's practically nothing from the early years.
So one thing I want to ask, like you were very specific about these mention of Brahmins, Kayas, and Dalits. How do you perceive this intersectionality of caste when it comes to this art? Like, were there difference in the material used, the theme, or output?
Themes is an interesting subject. The paintings of the upper caste young women tend to be of gods and goddesses and the Cobar. And I mentioned that I have 160 photographs of 160 Cobars. I've often wanted to put on an exhibition just of Cobars and how different, how varied Cobars are, because they are quite different. But those and images of gods and goddesses and folk stories and the critical, the sort of the social commentary. Those come from the gods, the upper castes. In fact, the only painting explicitly on caste discrimination against Dalits was by one of the Brahmin young women. I've never seen it shows a Dalit woman trying to go to a well by day and Brahmin women very well dressed shooing her away from the well, saying, and then in the second part of the painting it shows her going in the middle of the night to the well, to get water because it's safe then. That kind of painting is not done by the Dalits. The Dalits, aside from using a different technique, what they call the tattoo paintings, the Godina paintings.
Yeah.
That's limited to the Dalit community, though we've brought, and at times we've had Dalit painters come to the school and teach the upper caste how to do Cobar painting, Godina paintings. What's interesting is that in contrast to the gods and goddesses that the upper caste do, the Dalit painters very frequently use the tree of life. They work on the ground. They're actually farm laborers for the most part, and their families. They work with the animals, with the crops, and the tree of life is a central symbol. You saw it in that painting by Umbilical Davey with the migrant laborers scattered among the tree of life. It's a common thing. You don't see the tree of life among the upper castes. It's a very earthy symbol, and that's not where they're focused. Their paintings, they're looking up at the world of gods and goddesses and the cosmology. And the Dusad are looking at life on the ground. You see that there are many scenes of villages in the Dalit community, rituals going on in the villages around village ponds. Those are very common among them. So there are thematic differences. There's some crossover, but in general, that's where the difference is. The painting by the young woman of the Potter's village, for example, that you saw, that's in the Dalit community. I don't recall ever seeing one from the upper caste of something like the Potters in a village. That wouldn't be a common theme. And again, and the gender thing is also marked. The boys do, the young men do very benign, beautiful scenes, but they're not critical scenes. The critical paintings tend to come from the women. So there's a gender distinction as well as a caste distinction.
I was going through the website of Orias Barclay, where you have all they had actually some set of parameters for teaching Mithila painting. that was some essential for teachers. No, so there is something is mentioning like the politics of Mithila painting. That paper was wrote by you, and there was some other set of parameters also. Was there any parameter in Mithila Art Institute in Madhubani? Because if I go through the list of teachers, and before this interaction, actually, I had conversation with some students. They said that there was some kind of reversal process in terms of teachers. Like Santosh Das was teaching very contemporary themes. His emphasis was on contemporary themes, and Rani Jha and Godavari that they were coming from their traditions. So, was there any parameters you had decided?
Not really. The Santosh was concerned with technique as much as contemporary. If you recall, just before we hired him as the teacher and the director of the school, he had done that 22 painting series on the Gujarat riots. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's an extraordinary series of paintings. It was in the big traveling exhibition, Edge of Desire. It traveled around the world, and 14 of the 22 paintings was in that exhibit, and it's gone all around the world. And it was a condemnation of the rioting and as something which is just utterly un-Hindu, according to Santosh. He was very much moved. Those are the only paintings of that sort that he did. But at the time that he came into the role as teacher, he was very much concerned about current events and what had happened in Gujarat, because he had been at school in art school in Gujarat, and he was just horrified by the riots that went on. He did this amazing series of paintings. So that was something which drove him. Much less so when Shashikala Devi took over. That was not. She was a very traditional painter, and they taught together, so that you had both someone with contemporary issues and someone with more traditional issues. Rani Jha was very interested in contemporary issues. She did the women breaking through. She did the abortion clinic painting that you saw. But she also did a whole series of paintings on other figures, and mostly on women, but not all politically or socially present. Dulari did a mix of both. She probably did more Ganeshas than anybody else in the tradition, but also other more folksy kinds of things. Benita Jha has done very wonderful village scenes, very little on the way of political or social criticism. What we were looking for were the best painters at the time, people who were doing the best work, whether it was political or traditional or something in between. And we felt that we tried a number of other artists who turned out who were very good artists, but just weren't very good teachers. We had to find someone who was a very fine artist and who could compel the students and could excite the students. Some of them, I won't mention names, but there were several others that we tried for short periods of time, and they didn't work out. That was mostly Parmeshwar and Kaushik's issue, because they were there much longer. I would be there for 10 days to 2 weeks once a year, and so I didn't get a good sense of the teaching qualities of the different painters. But they did, and they got feedback from the students, of course, as well. So It was the quality of the work and their capacity to teach, the excitement which they created in the students rather than the subject matter that they
Aditi, we will take just two questions. I think we should wind up by 11. So one from you, and I'll ask the last one.
Okay.
Okay. So the one thing, so your point of contact was Parmeshwar sir, Parmeshwar Jha, as you, or there was like, when did you arrive? When you arrived here, who were the point of contact people? And the second part of this question only is, did they help you to formulate your initial perception about this folk art, or
Oh,
you had something?
absolutely. No, I knew nothing about it from the beginning. I learned a lot about it from Ray, because every time he would come back to the US, he would bring with him anywhere from that initial 35 to 75 or 100 paintings. And he would sit down with me and explain what was going on, what he had learned from the artist about that painting. And we would go through all the paintings. So I learned a lot from Ray. And then when I went in for the first time in 2002 after Ray died, I met for the first time all these artists whose work I had known for 20 years. And it was a very emotional experience. Quite extraordinary meeting someone that you've known through their work for such a long period of time. But it was Parmeshwar and Kaushik, for the most part, who obviously spoke Mithili and knew all the artists in a way that I never could, who would translate for me. A few of the artists could speak perfectly good English. That wasn't an issue with them. But for the bulk of the older artists, I needed a translator. So it was Parmeshwar or Kaushik almost entirely that were able to help. Once in a while, a younger member of the family, a granddaughter of a painter, would be able to explain what her grandmother was saying to me. But that was how I learned. It was just being there, learning from the paintings about the coaching. I hadn't read anything about it.
And lastly, I had talked to Kaushik ji and asked him that Ethnic Art Foundation was actually financed 3 films, but they used to mention only 2 films. Uh, is there any specific reason that you disown the film Nana Jogin? You never used to talk about that particular film, but we would like to know it actually.
It's a horrible film. We paid him too much money to do a film which turned out to be not about Mithila painting at all. He promised a film that was going to be dealing with the painting tradition, and what he did was a film. The first 3 or 4 minutes of the film shows a man trudging on a piece of sand with a rope over his shoulder, and you're just going on and on and on and on and on. And eventually you see that he's actually pulling a boat. This is a scene you never see in Mithila. I don't know where he got it from or where he took it from. And it was a scene about, when I asked him about it, he said, "Oh, this is about the horrors of life." What does that have to do with the painting? And then he arranged for some actors to come from Nepal to act a wedding, and they played a wedding, which didn't look like a Michael wedding at all. It was looked like a Bollywood movie wedding, and that's really what I remember of it. And we simply disowned it. We said, "You can do what you want with it, take our name off it. This doesn't represent Mithila painting in any way that we could find." This was my reaction. This was Parmeshwar's reaction. This was Kaushik's reaction. It was just something that he had made up on his own. We were infuriated because we put a lot of money into it. He had to bring a camera crew and artists from Nepal, and the whole thing became very expensive. we didn't realize what he was doing until it was already done. And it was there are so there's the five artists from that Ray did, and the Muni that Ray did. Those are the two things that we have done. There's a wonderful painting by Dulari Davey, a huge painting of Ray actually filming the ceremony when the women go into the chite, when they go into the pond. And it's a great big painting. It's in the museum here at Berkeley at the university. I can send you a copy of it. You can see Ray and his filming that scene that goes into the five painters towards the end of the five painters. But she did the scene of the film. So those are the
Aditi, you can wind up.
uh,
Closing remark.
Okay.
No, so it was like, even though I had researched, but it was definitely a very enlightening, very enriching to listen to David sir, like his ground experience. And of course, a lot of effort goes when you're building an institution. And an institution which, like, coming from West, exploring our art and culture, then taking it and proliferation, it takes a lot of task. And of course, you have an amazing collection of paintings. That is what I have to say, like, amazing collection you have. And thank you so much for such an enriching talk. And thank you, Sunil sir, for having me here and giving me the opportunity to meet David sir. It really means a lot for me. And it's really like glad to be associated with you also.
In fact, we have so many questions that must be addressed actually regarding the methodology of curriculum in Mithila Art Institute, and there are so many things actually we need to know from you. But I think we will catch you some other day. It's been almost 2 hours, so I think we should wind up now.
I look forward to staying in touch with all of you, with both of you and your colleagues. And if I can be of any assistance, further assistance, there's lots more to say about the painting tradition. I'm happy.
Yes.
I'm here and available on email very readily. You have my email, and please stay.
Yes.
We will, sir. Definitely.
Surely. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
You.
Namaste.
Yeah. Bye. Namaste.
Namaste.
Bye.